Hello and welcome to a short video that I'm calling a U.S. Government a Primer. We're going to talk about business and the law, and at some level you might be thinking, so why do I need to know about the U.S. government system and its structure? Because the reality is that much of what you will see when you open your text and begin reading is that what is done by the U.S. government is exactly the kind of law we are talking about. It's the U.S. government and the states and the localities that make the law that govern the relationship between individuals, between businesses and their clients, between the government and business. And so understanding the way in which the American political system works as the source of those laws is particularly important. So I'm not going to go into much detail, but this is probably just a reminder of some of those things you learned back when you were in, I don't know, fourth grade or whenever they teach civics. As a humorous way to begin our discussion, I thought I would show you a brief video of interviews of some students at George Mason University, probably done in the spring of 2016. And as I watched this, I would hope very much that perhaps Susquehanna students would do better on this quiz, but I don't know. Apologies for
But there's also a very other simple but important shot
just
here.
a moment.
And that's this 50-50. It's a good
Okay, here we go.
Hello everyone, it's Courtney Plunk here with Polytech. Today we are sending our team to see just how much students at George Mason know about their country. Let's find out if they're politically challenged.
Can I get your name and your major?
I'm Tristan Tucker, and my major is finance and management.
My name is Gianna. I'm a nursing major.
Dave Morel Moore Lopez, accounting.
Ryan Alexander, anthropology.
Sheree Favreau, and I major in government and international politics.
Can you tell me who this is?
No.
Who is this gentleman?
I have no idea.
I don't recognize who that is. No.
Ooh, I'm not sure. I don't know who that is.
Don't know. Don't care about politics.
I don't know.
Joe Biden.
No. John McCain.
I have no idea. But I probably should, but I also don't pay attention to a lot.
Was that a former president? Yeah. Was that Nixon, maybe?
Oh, that's, I've seen that guy before. I feel bad, I'm not sure who that is.
Is that Bill Clinton?
A politician of sorts.
Dude, I feel like I know him. I don't want to guess wrong, so I'm just not going to guess.
Richard Nixon?
Oh, God, I don't remember his name.
No, that is not Nixon.
It starts with Ronald Reagan. Got it.
I don't know which one. No, I can't. That's Kim Kardashian.
Ryan, who is this?
Kim Kardashian.
Yeah, that's Kim Kardashian. Kim Kardashian.
Kim Kardashian.
Kim Kardashian.
Kim Kardashian.
Kim Kardashian.
Kim Kardashian.
Kim Kardashian.
Kim Kardashian.
Can you tell me who's running for president besides Hillary Clinton?
This guy has a lot of money. This is gonna make me look stupid. I don't want to do this. Mission accomplished.
Can you tell me the name of the Vice President of the United States?
Biden.
Can you tell me who is a current U.S. Senator?
Any current U.S. senator? My senator is Claire McCaskill.
So I am sure that Susquehanna students could have aced those quizzes. I will admit that unfortunately I knew who the first two were. I did not know who Kim Kardashian was, so I guess I flunked the quiz the other way, right? So those aren't exactly the kind of things you necessarily need to know, but there are a few things that I think are important to understanding about the American political system. First of all, I want to ask you a question, or I want to give you an answer to a question that you probably haven't thought much about, but which often lie at the base of our frustrations about government. Whether you think government is too involved in your lives or not involved enough. We rarely spend time to think about the even bigger question stepping back, and that's the question of why do we need governments at all? Well, I would say that we don't have to have them if We want to live totally separate from each other without ever bumping into each other and without having interactions with other human beings. But unfortunately, that's probably not very likely. And if we want to live in some sort of a community, a political community, the problem is threefold. Resources are scarce, individuals hold different values, human beings are self-interested, and so conflict is inevitable. Let me take each one of those just for a moment in turn. Natural resources are scarce. We know that. We learned that early on in environmental studies classes, that all of those fun little pictures of resources you see listed here on the screen, there are only so many of them, and the reality is that we all want to have a piece of them. So we are all going to struggle for them. We're all going to try to get our own piece. Probably the one resource we know most about that is scarce is that of money, and so we all want to have our own little piece of the pie. That is probably a fact that we are not going to change. The second fact that we are not going to change is that the principles and values that underlie our political system, even within a democracy where we tend to agree on a large number of things, come into conflict, right? So there are times when if you want to have more liberty, that might mean less security. Do you want to have less screening at gates? Then perhaps you take risks that perhaps security. Or if you want to ensure that there is more equality across the board for people to be able to access certain services, then maybe that will take away somebody else's liberty. That might take somebody else's financial resources as we reallocate money. Inevitably, values and principles conflict, and we all hold slightly different weights as to what values and principles are most important in our lives. And yet we're all living together, bumping up against each other on a regular basis. The third fact that I don't think anybody will argue much with is that human beings are self-interested creatures. It doesn't mean we're selfish. It doesn't mean we can't think about other people. But when push comes to shove, our predominant way of thinking about things is to think about ourselves first. So when we have scarce resources, we have values and liberties that conflict, we have individuals thinking about only themselves, we are inevitably going to have conflict, right? So how do we manage that inevitable conflict? We create government and then use politics. Government, and this is a very broad definition, but just refers to those institutions to which we collectively agree to allocate the power we feel is necessary to manage this conflict. We agree to give certain powers to Congress, to the president, to the courts, to the states, and to our local governments, and give them enough authority that they can somehow manage this conflict that we inevitably will get into. Politics, I would call them the processes by which the government institutions and the citizens interact, right? But the bottom line is, as much as we complain about it, as much as we don't like what it does all the time, we're probably going to have to live with the fact that governments are inevitable. So the question is, how can we understand how they operate so that we can make sure that they have the kind of impact on us that we are most interested in having, right? The way we adopted in the United States with allocating power was twofold. On the one hand, we created a federal government with a term that I'm sure you heard of at least once in your educational background, created a federal government that has three separate institutions sharing powers, right? So power was allocated on a certain level, certain kinds of power allocated to the federal government to make regulations, and you're going to read about a lot of those over the course of the next 5 weeks, right? Regulations about contracts, about employment practices, about environmental regulations that affect business and industry, right? We have granted in the Constitution certain powers to Congress, to the president, and to the courts to make those kind of laws that affect our day-to-day lives. We also have a Bill of Rights in that U.S. Constitution that limits what government can do. So the Constitution says in some ways, we say, here's some powers we're going to give to you, and here's this whole set of things out here that you can't touch. Those are the things that we have in the Bill of Rights. So that's one system of structures that we've created in the United States that you're going to have that you're going to hear about a lot over the next few weeks. The other is this notion in the United States that we call federalism, right? So we maintain state governments with separate responsibilities from the federal government. What the state of Pennsylvania has the authority to do is sometimes different when it is the federal government has the authority to do. And lots of regulations end up being state-based regulations rather than federal regulations. The federal government has a tendency to focus on those things that are important for national security, for economy, for trade. You'll see when we start talking in your text about the fact that that there are ways that national commissions have been established to try and make sure that we standardize some of the laws state to state so that businesses and industry don't get hit with 51 different sets of regulations all the time. But we still have state governments who are sovereign, independent entities on their own, who have substantial authority over things like public health, safety, and welfare. If you're talking about a smaller, more local business, then you're going to be much more likely to be affected by the activities and roles of your state governments and of your local governments than necessarily by the federal government. And so we have a variety of different institutions that are created and given authority to make regulations on our behalf. And it is those sets of regulations that we're going to end up talking about in a variety of ways in the course throughout the rest of the, I want to say semester, but I guess over the course of the next few weeks. A couple of visuals to help you think about this in a little bit. I love this one because it's got this nice little pond, 3 branches of government. Yeah. Much of the time when we think about lawmaking, we think about the Congress, about the legislative branch, right? I post whether it's making taxes, whether it is establishing laws about contractual relationships, whether it's in passing environmental regulations that will have an impact on business and industry. Congress is the originator of most pieces of legislation. But they're not the only ones who make laws, and particularly in the business sphere, we will end up spending a lot of time talking about administrative regulations. And that is that Congress will pass a law, but it will be written in general terms, and those general laws then are given to an administrative agency to carry out. So the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, all of those executive branch agencies may be given a specific piece of legislation and then told by Congress, make this happen. To make this happen means that they establish a series of additional regulations that have the force of law, which individuals and businesses and industries must follow. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that. Last but not least, there's the judicial branch, which helps to oversee and apply those general laws to specific circumstances, and at times to determine the constitutionality of some of those laws. I'm going to have a video that we will look at during week 2 that will have a little bit more to say about the judicial branch and its relationship to business and industry. Okay. The other visual that I think might be helpful to you is this recognition that federalism really does recognize that we have 2 separate spheres of government with somewhat separate and independent powers. Right. So in this Venn diagram, we've got a set of powers that are national powers, a set of powers that are state powers, and then some that both federal government and state government can carry out. Most notably, of course, they can all collect taxes, something that we will all know on April 15th of every year. You can write your check to the state of Pennsylvania, and you can write your check to the Internal Revenue Service for the federal government. The notion here was originally to keep as much government as close to the people as possible, so that all those things you see listed as state powers are all things that we would want to keep as close to the people to be able to have some impact and influence on. Some of that has waned over time as the federal government has gotten bigger, as we have more multinational corporations rather than just national corporations. But the original premise is still there, and the original premise still allocates certain powers to the state governments and certain powers to the federal government. And we will see throughout the course of the next 4 weeks how these powers of the governments influence business and industry in a very real and meaningful way. Until next time, thank you.